are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview Oksana Kukurudza. Oksana is the author of the soon-to-be-released narrative nonfiction book Sunflowers Bend But Rarely Break, which is about the atrocities her Ukrainian ancestors faced at the hands of the Nazis and her ancestors' liberation by the United States Army. I'm here with Oksana Kukurudza, who is currently writing a narrative nonfiction book about the horrific experiences her ancestors suffered at the hands of Nazi Germany. Oksana, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate you having me on your podcast and giving me a platform and an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about this book that I'm writing.
Okay, feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure, Aaron, I'm happy to do that. So my name is Oksana Kukurudza, and I live in New York City. And I'm not an author by trade. I loved writing creatively when I was a child, but didn't think that it could be a practical way for me to earn a living. And so I ended up studying business in university and becoming a public accountant and then a management consultant. And I currently work for a company called Accenture. However, during my time in management consulting, I did have the opportunity to write for a few periodical type articles that were much more business related, as well as a colleague and friend of mine who was writing a couple of anthologies on business and leadership asked me to write a couple of chapters for her books, Going Against the Grain and Think Limitlessly. And while I was writing those chapters, I realized how much I fell back in love with writing. And after those anthologies were produced, the current war in Ukraine started up again. So Russia invaded in February 22nd of 2022. And I started to become much more involved in it. And I was really upset by what happened because not only are my parents Ukrainian, but also, I had the opportunity to live in Ukraine for a couple of years for work. And so I started to become much more involved and an advocate. I was going out and protesting, and I was paying attention to the news and just seeing, images and reading about, 6 million Ukrainians leaving and becoming refugees as they were escaping the war and the invasion. I was reading about the numbers and numbers of children that were being kidnapped, Ukrainian children kidnapped and taken to Russia. I was reading about people being put through infiltration camps, and all of these things reminded me of my parents' experience having been duped. They were living in Ukrainian Poland and then the Soviet Union in 1941, and Nazi Germans came and through kind of propaganda and posters and advertising duped my parents into coming to Nazi Germany on 6-month work visas because they offered them good jobs, good wages, and as soon as they arrived they took their papers away and they put them into slave camps, forced labor camps with no wages, working 12-hour days. And based on their experiences, as well as being refugees after the war, I could just see so much parallelism and repeating of history from World War II happening today with the war in Ukraine. And so I really want to write this book to be able to shine a light and educate Westerners as well as the rest of the world that things happening in Ukraine today happened during World War II, and we really have to say enough is enough, and let's not do this again.
Now, do you have a title for the book that you are currently writing? And without spoiling too much of that book, what will it be about?
Sure. So the book is called Sunflowers Bend But Rarely Break, and sunflowers are the Ukrainian national flower. And the reason I decided on that title is, I feel very much like not only Ukrainians, but also my parents and their story. You'll find that sunflowers bend towards the light in the darkest of days, but they don't break. And the story is really about resiliency. It's about how my parents, were duped. So, they thought they were moving to Nazi Germany for a better life, and yet they were stuck for 3-4 years in these slave camps, working 12-hour days for meager food, meager living, but they never lost hope. And they both went out of their way to ensure that they were liberated by the U.S. Army, and they fought hard to become refugees and not forced to go back to what would have been Soviet Ukraine or communist Ukraine after the war. And they fought hard to find a country to take them in and make their home the United States. And that's what this book is about. It's about hope and resilience.
Now, do you plan to self-publish your book, or do you plan to have the book traditionally published?
I would prefer to have it traditionally published. So I've written a first draft right now, and I'm in the process of making some edits to it and improving it, as well as I'm, looking for agents as well as publishers, traditional publishers, to take this project on.
Now, do you have a time frame in mind for when your book will be released, or is that still very much in the air?
It's a little bit in the air. If I choose to self-publish, then it will be ready much sooner, because the traditional publishing route can take much longer. And so if I do self-publish, I'm confident that I'll be ready to release it early next year. If I do go through a traditional publisher, it may be longer than that. However, I am in the works with a media company to potentially look for visual representations of this work, as well as I'm looking to have it published.
Now, how difficult is it to write narrative nonfiction compared to writing fiction or non-narrative forms of nonfiction?
So what's nice about narrative nonfiction is that I can take my parents' story, and they have a compelling story to start with, and I have an outline, right? An outline of their life, an outline of their experiences, and then it's trying to fill in the blanks. So the easy part is the stories there, the outlines there. The hard part of it is, as you can imagine, right, Erin, our parents don't tell us everything. They tell us the things they want us to know. And so I've had to piece things together by talking to relatives, talking to my siblings, but there are still blank pieces of their timeline. And so I'm having to fill it in as best I can based on the people that they became or how I think they are. I think with something that's fiction, you're starting with a blank slate of paper. And so it could be harder if you don't have a good story in mind, but it could be a lot easier if you do have a good story in mind, because you don't have the constraints of writing about a person's life that exists, right? And trying to be true to a real human being, as opposed to a fictional character.
Now, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what parallelisms are there between the horrific experiences that Ukrainians had to endure during and immediately after the Second World War and what Ukrainians are currently experiencing at the hands of Russian invaders today?
Sure. So there's definitely a few parallels. So one is back during World War II, 12 million Eastern Europeans, and they weren't necessarily all Ukrainians. I don't have the exact number of Ukrainians, but millions of Ukrainians were either enticed to come to Nazi Germany to work as slaves, or they were kidnapped to work in Nazi Germany as slaves. today in Ukraine, we've been hearing that Ukrainians in parts of occupied Ukraine are being taken away by Russians if they think for a moment that they aren't 100% supportive of Putin's regime, and put through filtration camps and potentially reprogramming camps. So you have the same camp experience that happened in World War II that the Nazis are doing with what's happening, with what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians and the occupied territories. So that's one parallelism. The second is after World War II, you had these 12 plus million, 15, 20 million people that were all displaced throughout Europe after the war. And today you have about 6 million Ukrainians that have had to leave Ukraine and move to another country, either within Europe, US, Australia, Canada, and are displaced persons. So that's a second, clear parallelism. The third one that my parents didn't necessarily experience, but existed as well, was that the Nazis were known to kidnap children that were, blonde and fair-haired and try to make them German. We're hearing stories now, and even Russia's claiming they have something like 700,000 Ukrainian children that they've kidnapped and are keeping in camps or with Russian families in occupied Ukraine or in Russia to reprogram them to become Russian. So those are, to me, some of the main parallelisms that I'm seeing from the experience my parents went through during World War II and what's happening to the Ukrainian people today by Russia.
Now, during the mid-1990s, and this was not long after Ukraine won its independence from the failed Soviet Union, you spent a year and a half in Ukraine, and what was your work during that time like?
Sure. So I arrived in the middle of winter in January of 1996. So I experienced what a really tough kind of Ukrainian-Russian winter can look like. And I arrived to work at Deloitte & Touche, a public accounting firm, and that operates globally and was operating in Kyiv, Ukraine. And a lot of the work that we were doing is we were helping Ukrainian companies obtain investment from either International Monetary Fund, World Bank, or the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And these companies were very antiquated. They operated still in a Soviet environment, even though Ukraine was independent. And so they did their accounting in a very different way than how we would do it in the West. So what we did was went into these companies and helped them redo their accounting books so that a Westerner could really understand their books of records and understand, if they were making any net income, what kind of assets and liabilities that they had. Some of the, interesting experiences that I had was just, seeing, how companies operated in the Soviet Union, because many of these companies still operated the same way, and they desperately needed investment from Western companies because their equipment was antiquated, their means and operations were very antiquated, and they weren't making any money, Erin. I mean, I remember showing up to a shoe factory that needed some foreign investment, and the workers would laugh and say, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, which was apparently a slogan during the Soviet Union as well. And they would show up to work at this factory. No, they couldn't sell the shoes, so the company would give them shoes at the end of the week as their salary, and then they would have to go out and sell these shoes in the local markets of their town to be able to, to have, to buy food to eat. that was a little bit of the situation that was happening in Ukraine at the time. And so you had a lot of people impoverished, especially the very old, who didn't have a pension anymore. They had lost their safety net. But then you also had this very vigorous, opportunistic and excited group of young people that I worked with who were extremely excited to work with Western companies and to see Western companies come in and see the opportunity of learning from them and growing in their careers.
Yeah, that anecdote about people having to sell shoes to make a living being the business model of a company would simply not fly in the Western world.
No, it wouldn't. And honestly, it wasn't. I don't believe that's how the Soviet Union operated. Ukraine was in this tricky situation in the mid-90s where it was no longer a socialist country, right? It was now a democracy. It was now a capitalist country. But yet, its society, the people, the companies hadn't evolved and changed enough to be able to operate successfully in capitalism because they didn't have products that the local Ukrainians wanted or that the rest of the world wanted to export. So these shoes that they were making, they were very antiquated. They weren't things that people would want to buy and wear. They weren't fashionable. So what they really needed to do was they needed the investment from Western and foreign companies to put in new equipment so that they could and help them buy raw materials to produce shoes that people would want that they could then export or sell locally. So they were in that tough transition process.
Now, one final question I have, what was it like for you to grow up in a family with 11 siblings?
It was a lot of fun. So it was highly competitive because my parents were immigrants and they were, the working class, worked with their hands. My father was a butcher. My mother worked at a local department store at night cleaning. Cleaning the department store at night. And so there wasn't a lot of, there wasn't a lot of food and there weren't a lot of material goods in the house. So, there was definitely competition in our family with each of us, especially, being such a large family. But there was also a lot of love and a lot of fun. I mean, you didn't need to have a lot of friends, Erin, because you could play with your older brothers and sisters.
Yeah, I grew up in a family where I only had one sibling, and not long after he was born, he enlisted in the U.S. Army because he was 19 and a half years older than me. I lived more like an only child than someone who actually, than a typical person who has one or more siblings. And my older brother's the same way. He enlisted in the armed forces not long after I was born. So he was raised more like an only child than someone with a younger sibling would normally be raised because of the age difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a little bit of that. My sister closest to me in age she's 8 years older than I am. And so we still had them in the house, right? Because they were, they were teenagers as I was growing up. And so I always say that I had the fun of having not only my own mother, but I had 5 sisters that were like my other mothers. So I had 6 mothers growing up. And let me tell you, I had the shortest leash you could ever imagine.
Well, Oksana, you are a very interesting person to interview, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. I really appreciate you having me here. And if you wouldn't mind, I did create a landing page. Would you mind if I tell the readers, your listeners, the reading page for the landing page for the book?
Go ahead and do that, and I'll include a link in the text description of the episode once it's uploaded.
Okay, perfect. It's www.sunflowersrarelybreak.com. And again, Erin, thank you so much for having me. And hopefully I can come back again sometime.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you.
Oksana was a wonderful guest with an interesting life story, and I wish her well with the release of her upcoming book. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.